a State of the Science Conference on Research and Technology for Blindness and Low Vision, held at Smith-Kettlewell on December 4th, 2015. Highlights from a day of discussion and idea exchange among experts, consumers, and other stakeholders.
Panel 4, Access to Spatial Information. How can research leverage emerging tools and improve access? Richard Ladner.
Now, I want to distinguish two forms of access here that nobody's talked about this much, but I think they get confused quite a bit. So one is access to common media. So for example, if you have a textbook that everybody in your class is using, a blind person should have access to the very same textbook, the same figures in the book, not some separate stuff. So that's access to common media. So that would be books, including text, images, and math, maps, including embedded text, images, including embedded text, video, and web. So those are the main categories. And then there's access to information, which is more general. So access to things like books, particular books, and things like that. Students need that, but they also need access to information. And that's where we have alternatives to visual sources of information.
Dianne Pawluck.
As an engineering professor, there's very little that's been done in engineering access. From fundamental things like free body diagrams and circuits, which they need to learn to analyze devices, to actual tools that we use and teach that are for designing, whether electric circuits or mechanical designs and things like that. They're all important. And it's not just interacting with these tools, it's being able to communicate with people who are sighted. And from a teaching point of view, it's also being able to teach somebody who's blind at the same time that you're teaching the sighted people. And so imagine a professor writing on an electronic whiteboard. If they're fast enough and you have the tools for it, you could be displaying this in real time to a student who is seeing the process as the person is building up the diagram.
Sheila O'Madron.
Another thing which I think spatial information will really help us solve, if we can do it, is this notion of dynamic information. So in a lot of cases where you're doing a collaborative document, the reason why collaborative documents are so hard for visually impaired people to use is because you can't see what's happening at the point that isn't under your cursor. So you can't see when somebody else is editing a paragraph or changing things like that. So if you have a spatial display, it may alert you and you can kind of reach over and say, okay, I'll leave that alone till that person's done with it.
Anne Bowie.
I absolutely agree about the sort of movement into the mainstream. And one of the interesting aspects of 3D fabrication is that it's so much in the mainstream, clearly of a certain segment of the population, but it's increasingly so that one of the advantages of that is we've talked about crowdsourcing before for, say, image description or audio description. We are now talking with maker communities, maker spaces in libraries and museums, et cetera, about crowdsourcing objects for the classroom for students with disabilities or even students without disabilities, because the maker community is looking at all this great technology and saying, I don't want to make another Yoda head.
Amanda Lueck.
If you're thinking about making models for kids who are totally blind, a lot of the things that are presented to them, if they're miniaturized, are abstractions. And so they won't have any idea of what it is. They could identify the shape and would learn it, but they wouldn't really know how it related to, the small cow to a real cow.
Joshua Miele.
I don't think that it's a unique problem with tactile models or graphics. It's something that, like, why is this not an issue with visual graphics? And I think it is, actually. And I think that sometimes the real issue is lack of exposure of young blind kids to variety rather than a problem with the graphics or models that we're showing them.
Lisa Wadors Verne.
When we think 3D printing, I encourage you to think of it in many stages. There's the design process, the actual printing process, and then the pedagogy and the use of the objects. It's important to understand, you want to print something that's either too big, too small, too fragile, or too dangerous. So in the instance of the cow, maybe it makes better sense to go to the farm and visit a cow. The objects alone are not sufficient. We need to have that other understanding around it so that people who are experiencing things can experience it with all the knowledge that they need.
This meeting is supported by NIDLR Grant 90RE5008-02-00 and Smith-Kettlewell. The views expressed in this meeting do not necessarily represent the policy of NIDLR, ACL, HHS, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.